Now it's yours for free. To get your 1-year subscription, click the link in the description, download and install TradingView Desktop, log into your account, and that's it. Your subscription will activate automatically. Yes, we know. It's amazing. You're saving $2,400 a year, and there are no hidden conditions. Just remember, this offer is only for the desktop version, so don't miss out. Thank you for being with us. Happy birthday, TradingView.
All right, team, we're transitioning to Flack, but tasks are still going to be on Bullfrog.
Did nobody see my poppycock post? There was no clappy claps on it.
Make sure you track your time on Fireplace. Then, ping me on SmackDog.
Guys, we don't need any of those anymore. We have ClickUp.
Where do we chat?
ClickUp.
What about managing projects?
ClickUp.
Docs.
Also ClickUp.
AI.
It's all ClickUp.
Yeah, but how do we get Adam's dog to stop peeing in the office?
Passing into fetch, the things that fetch is doing by default. So you are, okay, step number 1, basic fetch. So jumping into here, in our basic fetch file, we want to look at what is the simplest way that we can do a fetch call with the default values for absolutely everything and anything. So inside my method, I want to fetch this endpoint. Now, if I were to take this and just jump into the browser, right here. We take a look at that. Here we go. This is the result. I'm going to fetch this JSON file. Now, it's an array that's filled with a whole bunch of objects. That's what JSON is. It's arrays and objects, strings, numbers, booleans, all that fun stuff. So I'm going to get this data, but I don't want to replace my current web page with that data. That's the purpose of fetch. We want to be able to tell JavaScript to tell the browser, hey, I would like a copy of this file so that I can use it and then generate some data. I want to take all the names out of all these objects and build a list on the page or something else. So we want to get some data and we want to use it as part of our web page without having to refresh the entire web page. That's the idea behind fetch. So what is the simplest way that we could do this? Well, we have this command called fetch. So every browser supports this. Every browser since about 2016 has supported this command, fetch. And we can pass to it a string as a URL. So this is the one that I want to get. And there's a whole bunch of options that we can set. But like I said, we're going to use the most simple method with all the default values. So this is all that we have to pass in, this string. We pass to the method. I can save it. I can run it. That has actually run. If I go into my network tab here, we can see in the network tab that sure, what was done to this user's endpoint, this URL, and here is the data that came back. So we got that data coming. We're still on the same page. We did actually fetch the data. Now, if I want to use that data, see in the network, ordered this command, and we can pass to it a string that is there's a whole bunch of options that we can set, but like I said, we're going to use the most simple method with all the default values. So this is all that we have to pass in, this string we passed to the method. I can save it. I can run it. That has actually run. If I go into my network tab here, we can see in the network tab that sure enough, a fetch was done to this user's endpoint, this URL, and here is the data that came back. So we got that data coming back to the browser. We're still on the same page, but we did actually fetch the data. Now, if I want to use that data on my page, what I need to do is I need to add more to this. So we're going to put a couple of methods called then. On the end here, not write them all in the same line, but it's much easier to read if you make this stack on top of the other. The fetch method returns something called a promise. Basically, it's a wrapper around response that's coming back. In the browser, when we pasted this URL in, we got a response from this web server. It sends back a response object. Inside that response object was the JSON file that we're looking at right here. So over here, I want to do the same sort of thing. I'm going to say the response object from that URL. When you get it back, this then method will sit there and wait until the response has come back. So I can put a function inside of here. So we can write it like this, just a standard function, or you can write an arrow function like this. So inside of here, what's going to be passed into this function, I could also use a named function. If I had a function here called Fred, then somewhere else on my page, here's that function Fred. The then method will take whatever was inside the promise this thing returned, which is our response object, and it'll pass it to this function. So we will have a response object. You don't have to use the full word response. This is a variable. REST, RES, something like that, RET. But this is the response object that is coming back from here. Now, Fred, okay, I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to make this a little bit simpler with an arrow function, and I still get this response object. So here is my function. Instead of having a named function over here, I've just got an anonymous arrow function. This is the response that came back from the server. If I do console.log, take a look at this response object. There it is. Here is the response. This is the URL. This is where we sent the request to. And what was the status? Status was 200. Everything was good. We got back what we were expecting to see. Fantastic. So I have my response. Usually you'll want to check and see if the thing that came back actually did work. And that is actually the purpose. if something went wrong. So when we do the first fetch, if we're unable to connect to the network, this command will fail, and down here, we will get an error object. So again, we have a function inside of here. My error object will be coming from here, or it could be coming from this then, or it could be coming from this then. If there's a failure anywhere in any of these, the error will be inside of here. We can console.warn, let's say, the message. We can take a look at that if something failed. Now, inside of here, we always want to do error hand. Always want to check for problems at every step. So if my fetch got a result, but the result was, say, a 404 error, I mistyped the name, this. So that's going to fetch, but it's going to return a 404 error. So we can check that. We can say, okay, what is the status? There's a status property. Here it is, 404. We got a 404 error. And right here, this is the error message.
Get 15 free weekly transfers to other banks or e-wallets using the CBank app. Download CBank now.
It's going to fetch, but it's going to return a 404 error. So we can check that. We can say, okay, what is the status? There's a status property. There it is, 404. We got a 404 error. And right here, this is the error message that's happening down here. So this thing failed to get, the browser is telling us that this fetch failed, and it's writing out an error message. This isn't the console.warn, sorry. This is the browser writing out an error message to say that the fetch failed. In ours, we know what the status is, 404. It didn't exist. There is no page called this. I want to check and make sure that the status is somewhere in the 200s. With HTTP status codes, the 100s are all an intermediate status. The 200s are all, hey, everything worked out. 300s, things are probably good, but there was some sort of redirect or something like that that happened. So you asked for this resource, but I gave you this one instead. I still gave you something, but there was something that had to be changed about it. 400s, there was something wrong with the request. I couldn't complete the request because you didn't have permission. You didn't give me the API key. There was something wrong with the request. 404, the page isn't there. So the request was sent, response came back, but there was something wrong. And then anything in the 500s, that is server-side error. So programming on the server side failed for whatever reason. Now, we want to know if everything is in the 200 to 299 range. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to say if response, or my rest variable here, that okay. If it's okay, it means that it was in the 200 to 299 range. If it's not, so I'll do this. If not, okay, I will throw new error. Write some sort of message so that it comes up. And this one we will see here. We change this, so we will get a 404 error. This will catch it, throw an error. The error will come down into this catch, and this function right here will run because we're generating an error. There we go. Was not a valid response. Now, if I change this back to proper users, there we go. I don't see the error message happening. So instead, what I want to do is I want to take the response that came back, and I know it's a JSON file, so I want to extract from the response the JSON data. I want to take the string that's inside the file, which I know is a JSON string, and I want to turn it into a JavaScript object. So we will return rest.json, and this is a method to extract JSON string and convert it to an object. All right. Returning from a then will take us to the next then. This is going to return a promise, and the promise will sit here in front of the then until it has resolved when the promise is ready. So basically, what we're saying is, whenever this method is finished extracting the JSON string, converting it into an object, when all that's done, this function will be called. So we're doing fetch, and then we're going to call this function, and then we're going to call this function. And the cool thing about then is it's always going to wait. And so our data object right here, if I console.log the data object, we can see the contents. There it is. It's an array with 10 objects, just like we saw here. It's an array that has inside of it 10 objects. There we go. Same thing that we have right here. And now, this is a JavaScript object like any JavaScript variable. And if I want to build HTML content with it, I can, which we're going to get into in a future step. All right, so we have this. Now, why do we use the then? One last thing in this first step. Why do we use the then? And it's because I can't do this. I can't say, hey, I want to go get that data, and I'm going to put the result. Here's my response object. I'm going to put it inside of here. And then what I want to do is I want to get that data. Let data obj equal response.json and console.log data object. This is going to fail. This will not work. And it won't work because we're not waiting right here. We're saying, go do this thing. Now, JavaScript is going to be happy enough to send that request off. It'll say, okay, I'll go and I'll get that stuff for you. And it looks at first glance like what it's going to do is it's going to say, all right, we'll put the response object into here. But this is going to be a promise object. Because this thing returns a promise object. It doesn't return the response. It returns a promise object that sits here waiting until whatever it is done. When it's complete, then this is the contents of that promise. Here, we're returning JSON string turned into a JavaScript object, wrapped in a promise that sits here until we have the actual data. Then it gets passed into here. Here, we're not waiting. So this is going to fail. Here we go, uncaught type error. Response.json is not a function. So we can't call response because this thing is a promise object. Promise objects don't have a method called response or called JSON. So this will fail every time. Right, so that's the end of step. It's your basic fetch. That's understanding promises. That's understanding the sequence, how we can chain these things together with the thens, how you always should have a catch at the very end of it. Because we always want to do error handling. We always want to check and make sure that things work at every step along the way. Okay, moving on to number 2. So the alternate syntax. Moving into here, try and async. So this is the difference. promise where we were doing fetch dot then dot then dot catch, and we were doing that because this returns a promise, and then we were returning a promise from here. And this was the last step in our sequence. This was here to catch an error at any step along the way. Now, if you want, you can say that your function is asynchronous, meaning if you do anything inside this function that uses a promise, you can use the keyword await to pause at that step. So what do I mean by that? You do a fetch for the URL, and I'm using the same one as before. And that thing that I was saying never to do would say, hey, here's my response object. And then from my response object, I'm going to get my data object. And we're going to say, you've got a response, and from the response, I'm going to extract the JSON. And you can see it automatically did this for me. This is what we want to do. In front of the fetch, in front of the response.json, anywhere that we are going to call a method which returns a promise, which is something that needs to wait for a little while before getting a response. We do this. Because it's asynchronous, we're allowed to do this. We can say, all right, call fetch, but don't assign the result to this variable until after it comes back. Again, here, don't do anything until we get the response back. So we can console.log response here, and we will have an actual response object. And down here, console.log data object, we will actually have the data object coming back. There is. And there it is. See, this is in my second file. So I'm getting the same results, doing the same thing. A lot of people will look at this and go, okay, this is much simpler. It's only 2 lines of code. I don't have to write all the thens inside of here. My personal preference is to use the then chain. I like how it encapsulates all this functionality. But I know that that is not everybody's preference. Some people do prefer this syntax. Downside of this syntax is we can't just leave it like this because we have zero error handling here. If we want to do error handling, we still have to add that in. inside of a try block is a catch. And here's the error at the end, like this. So now I can do console.warn. Here's my error message. Tab this all in. This will handle failing the fetch, but the response, I still need to check and make sure the response is okay. So I still have to do this. I still have to say, if not, response.okay, throw new error. And that comes down here. So let's test this. Try catch. Now we have some error handling. Write an invalid URL. Now we get the 404 error, which means that this should trigger an error, which should go down to the catch. And there we are. Here's the response. This is on line 11. And then the error comes down, and line 16, that is our console.warn right here. So this part's not running. We're never getting to this part of our code because we're throwing an error, and that jumps down to the catch. Same sort of approach, just a different way of writing code. So we've got try catch instead. Ways of doing it, both work. It's just whichever syntax feels more comfortable to you, whichever one you feel is more real. They're both valid syntaxes. All right, so that is the end of number 2. Moving on to number 3, understanding more of the parts that come with fetch. So what do we mean by parts? There's other objects, and in that first version of fetch call that we were making, we were using all the default values. So now we're going to start looking at some of those other options, the other parts, things that we're passing into fetch, the things that fetches by default. So URL, when you call fetch like this, what we put inside of here could be, we're using all number 2. Moving on to number 3. Feels more comfortable to you, whichever one you feel is more readable. They are both valid syntaxes. All right, so that is the end of it. Number 3, understanding more of the parts that come with and in that first simple version of fetch call that we were making, we were using all the default values. So now we're going to start looking at some of those other options, the other parts of things that we're passing into fetch, the things that fetch is doing by default. So a URL, what do you call fetch like this? What we put inside of here could be string, which is what we were doing before, something like this. This is a URL string. We can put a URL object. So that's what we're going to build first of all. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at here. The URL object. You can pass a string like this into the URL constructor, and it's going to give you a URL object. So what's the benefit of that? Well, if you had this string and you were using this string, nothing wrong with it. It's going to work fine with fetch. But if you needed to get at any of bits and pieces, so what if I only want the path, folder, and file name? What if I only wanted port number? What if I only wanted protocol? If I wanted the domain? What if I wanted the origin? What if I wanted just the query string? So there's all these other parts, or the hash value. There's all these different pieces that make up a URL. Yes, I can use string methods to say, okay, split it wherever there's a /, find the question mark, find the hashtag. There's all these things that we can use to extract bits and pieces, but it's a lot more code than, hey, if I just had the property name, that's going to work just fine. So inside of here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, here's my URL, URL object, and there's 2 ways to get it. Which is what we typically do. But you can also split it into 2 pieces. There could be a string, which you can think of as being this part of the URL, or the base, which is this part. So if you split it up, you can have the base and this as 2 separate strings, or just pass in the whole thing, which is what I'm going to do right here. Here we go. I have created a URL object. Console.log, URL.host, URL.origin, URL.protocol, .port, path name, and so on. There's all these properties that I have up here. These are all bits and pieces of what we have inside that URL. Right? We have to go back to our main page, and we have to switch this over to number 3. We're no longer on number 2. And there we are. So here it is. There's the origin. There's the protocol. Here's the port. This is the path name, which is the folder and file name. This is the host. So we've got all these different bits and pieces that we get for free just by wrapping string inside of a URL object. The fetch, it's happy to take a string. It's happy to take a URL object. It's also, here we can quickly throw one out then just to show that it works. My response object. Just bring up the status. I'll give us a 200. There it is. There's the 200 status coming up. So string. two of the different things that we can pass into a fetch. The third one is a request object. There's actually a request object that we can build. So we can say const request equals new request. So a request here. So string URL, two of the different things that we can pass into a fetch. The third one is a request object. There's actually a request object that we can build. So we can say const request equals new request. So a request object, you can see here, we can pass in a URL object right here, and then there's an init property. So there's an object where we can put a whole bunch of settings inside of it. So let's do that. I'm going to pass in my URL. Just like fetch, the request is going to be able to accept a string or a URL object. Then there's options. So inside of here, in the request, what are things that you might want to put in there? Well, headers. There's a headers object, a headers setting, where I can set up various headers. Now, I'm just going to throw one in here as a sample. We'll come back and talk more about headers later on. But we can put x/Steve, and the value is going to be hello. So I've created a header, and I put it inside of there. There's different ways of creating it. This is the most basic. There's no error handling whatsoever. But I'm just going to throw it in there just to show that we can do that. The method, the default method that we use for every fetch call, unless we specify otherwise inside the request, is get. Now, I will come back and talk more about these methods, but get you can think of basically as read. I want to read some data from the server. I want to go and get a file. I want to get an image, get a JSON file. That's what get is. I'm not sending any data to the server necessarily. I just want to get something back. So that's what this means. And then once the stuff comes back, what do I want to do with it? Well, there is a property called cache, and you can set it to one of these values right here. So the default, if I set it as that, so this is, if I'm not putting anything in there, means this. Cache first. So I'm going to go and check in the browser's HTTP cache. So every time you visit a web page, the browser is saving those files that it brings and downloads. So the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, the images, all those things are being saved in your browser. That's the history of your browser. It's saving all of these things. It's caching them in an HTTP cache. So this is all HTTP cache, not to be confused with the cache API, which is another topic. There's a video that I've done on that. If you look up at the top there, you'll find that. So not the cache API, but an HTTP cache in the browser. So save it to the cache, or look in the cache first to see if it's there. If it's there, but it's too old, it's expired, it's gone beyond its before date, then we're going to send a request off to the server. And if the server says it has a newer copy, we will download it and we will update the cache. We'll replace what's in the cache. Reload means always go to the cache. Don't bother checking the cache first. Just go to the server, get the new one, bring it back, and put the new one in the cache. New store means always go to the server, but don't bother updating my cache. Just get a new copy off the server. Don't save it. No cache means make a request to the server and say, here's the current age of what I've got. Do you have a newer version? And if it does, it will send back the new one, and we will update the cache and use the latest version that came back from the server. Force cache. If there's nothing in the cache, make the request and then save it. Only if cache means don't bother ever sending a request to the server. Just go and look in the cache. If it's there, use it. If not, this is the error that we will get. So right here, we can say cache. This is a setting for the request. This is in the options object for the request. And I'm going to set this to, let's say, no store. So I'm not going to bother saving it in my cache. So here, I can put the string, the str from up here. I can put the URL. I can put my request object. Any of those are going to work. To bring back our response, there it is. There's our 200 response. So we should always have our then for data handling and our catch with the error. So we will say pass it to console.warn. That's going to be the error message. Inside of here, we will check to make sure it worked. So if not response, error. Want to have the data. So we will extract the data from there by returning call to response.json. And I'm calling response.json because this is going to be a JSON file. It's my local JSON file that I created. So this is coming back data here, and I can console.log the data. So this is the JavaScript object created from the JSON string that was inside the response object. And there it is. Here is our data. So this is the JavaScript. From string. It's inside the response object. And here is our JSON JavaScript object. Basic object. Right. So that is number 3. Working with URL objects, request objects, headers object. We'll come back and talk more about the headers object, but just be aware that this is like settings for the request header. There's some settings that happen in the browser, some happen on the server. Moving on to number 4. Understand the response. So Got a response object? Sure. There's a lot more to it. Just this kind of, so let's take a look at that. In my response. Could you move it here? Set up one. Pointing to different files. One's a JSON file, one's an image, one's a font file, one's an HTML file. So we have all these different files. We can make requests for any of those using fetch. When we do the fetch, we know we get back a response object called OK property to see that it won't. But it is also possible for us to build our response. I have an object here. So JavaScript object, plain ordinary JavaScript object. We turn that into a JSON string right here. So I'm calling JSON.string file, turning this into a string. We're going to this in two steps. Let's see. JSON string. This. Oh, yeah, that string. Put it inside of the call for files. Requests from any those using fetch. JSON file. There's a lot more to it. Just so let's take a look at that. So in my response, I've got a little bit here set up already. I have a bunch of examples. So these are strings pointing to different files. One's a JSON file, one's an image, one's a font file, one's an HTML file. So we have all these different files. Requests for any of those using fetch. When we fetch back a response object, we call the OK property to see that it worked. But it is also possible for us to build our response objects. So let's look at what a response object actually is. I have an object here. So JavaScript object, plain ordinary JavaScript object, I'm going to turn that into a JSON string right here. So I'm calling JSON.string file. I'm turning this into a string. So I'm going to do this in two steps. My JSON string. Time. Start yourself. I'm type of file. I response object. So I don't have to go fetch call to the response object. Now, that's the whole purpose of what we're learning here today is about fetch calls. And we'll look at some different ones here in a minute. But this is what a response object is. It's a container that has a file inside of it. It's the body of the response. So every HTTP request and response, it's basically an object. So we've got this HTTP request object, there's the HTTP response object that comes back from the server. Both of them are constructed the same way. There's a head and a body. Both of them have these two parts to them. There's also a footer as well, but we never touch the footer. We don't have to worry about it. We can forget that it even exists and it won't affect anything that we do. So let's just think of it as these two parts. Inside the head, this is where all the settings are. This is where we have those things like the cache setting and the headers, the actual headers saying, hey, I'm using the get method. Here's the URL that I'm going to. This is the coordinate that I'm using. Here's the status code of the response. All these things are inside the head. The body is the actual file. That's what we have down here. This file that we created, that we passed in here, that is the body. It is possible that the response is null. There is nothing inside of there. When we make a GET request from the server, this is null. It is empty. When you make a GET request, you're not allowed to put anything inside the body. The response will hopefully have something in the body. Now, it's possible that it's empty, it's null, but most of the time, you will have something inside that body. So here's my body. This is in my response object, and then three settings, three properties inside the options object for the response. A status code to say, hey, it's good or it's bad. Status text, it can be whatever you want. Typically, if it's 200, that means okay, so you write something like that. And then headers. We had some headers before we got that object inside of it. Here's a couple actual headers. If you're building custom headers, this can come up with their own names, but they have to start with the letter X. There's the value, here's the name. If it starts with an X, you can create whatever headers you want. But there are headers that you're allowed to use, and there's other ones that you're not allowed to touch. You're not allowed to change. It's only the browser that's allowed to set them. Right, so that is number 3. Working with these URL objects, working with the request objects, the headers object. So we will come back and talk more about the headers object, but just be aware that this is like the settings for the request that are going to be. There's some settings that happen in the browser, there's some that happen on the server. We're going to talk more about those coming up. Moving on to number 4. Understanding the response. So, we got a response object, sure, but there's a lot more to it than just this method. So let's take a look at that. So in my response, so a little bit here set up already. I have a bunch of examples. So these are strings pointing to different files. One's a JSON file, one's an image, one's a font file, one's an HTML file. So we have all these different files. We can make requests for any of those using fetch. When we do the fetch, we know we get back a response object. We look at the OK property to see that it worked. But it is also possible for us to build our own response objects. So let's look at what a response object actually is. I have an object here. So JavaScript object, plain ordinary JavaScript object. I'm going to turn that into a JSON string right here. So I'm calling JSON.stringify. I'm turning this into a string. So we can do this in 2 steps. So let's say my JSON string is this. Oh, and then that string, I'm putting it inside of an array, and I pass it to a file constructor. So I'm building a brand new file. This is what I'm going to call it. And this is the MIME type, the data type of the file. Then I can build a new response object. So I don't even have to go and make a fetch call to create a response object. Now, it's the whole purpose of what we're learning here today is about fetch calls, and we will look at some different ones here in a minute. But this is what a response object is. It's a container that has a file inside of it. This is the body of the response. So every HTTP request and response is basically an object. So we've got this HTTP request object. There's an HTTP response object that comes back from the server. Both of them constructed the same way. There's a head and a body. Have these parts to them. There's also a footer as well, but we never touch the footer. We don't have to worry about it. We can forget that it even exists, and it won't affect anything that we do. So let's just think of it as these two parts. Inside the head, this is where all the settings are. This is where we have those things like the cache setting and the headers, the actual headers saying, hey, I'm using the get method. Here's the URL that I'm going to. This is the port number that I'm using. Here's the status code of the response. All these things are inside the head. Body is the actual file. That's what we have down here. This file that we created, that we passed into here, that is the body. It is possible that the response is null. There is nothing inside of there. When we make a GET request, the server, this is null. It is empty. When you make a GET request, you're not allowed to put anything inside the body. The response will hopefully have something in the body. Now, it's possible that it's empty, it's null, but most of the time, you will have something inside that body. So here's my body. This is in my response object. And then 3 settings, 3 properties inside the options object for the response. Status code, say, hey, it's good or it's bad. Status text, it can be whatever you want. Typically, if it's 200, that means okay. So you write something like that. And then headers. We had some headers before. We had written out that object with the string inside of it. Here's a couple of actual headers. If you're building custom headers like this, we can come up with our own names, but they have to start with the letter X. So there's the value. Here's the name. If it starts with an X, you can create whatever headers you want. But there are headers that you're allowed to use, and there's other ones that you're not allowed to touch. You're not allowed to change. It's only the browser that's allowed to set them. Here we have content type and content length. So in my response object, I've got this file. This is the kind of file that it is, and this is the size in bytes of that file. So we can console.log this response object we got back, and there it is. So here, can console.log this response object we got back. So here, line 20, this is the object right here. This object, here's the string version of it, which is the contents of our file, and then our response that we built. We're taking a look at the response object. There it is. Status 200, status text, CMI named. And we can look to see what those headers are if we want. So in our response, we can say, hey, I want to look at the headers inside of there. Can you get me the header called content type? Can you get me the header called content length? We want to take a look at those headers inside this response object. There it is. So anytime that you need to read the headers from a response object, assuming you're accessing one thing, don't access, you're not allowed to access all of them, remember that. But assuming that they are there and you're allowed to access them, this is how you do it. Response.headers.get, and then the name of the header. And so dealing with fetch calls and these response objects, we can do fetch calls for these. Let me comment that one out. So we'll just very quickly pack a couple of these to take a look at them. So I'm going to look for the image string. And again, I can use the string. I can create a URL object. I can create a request object. Then we get our response coming back. We will check if response.OK is not true. New error. We'll learn from this first again. Then the response dot, this is not JSON, this is an image. So instead of doing response dot JSON, we're going to do response dot blob. Blob stands for binary large object. Basically, it means that this is a binary file. It's not a text file. This is an image. It's a video. It's a media file of some sort. It's a font. So it's not text. And inside of our next, and then we get a blob coming back. We'll have our catch at the very end. This is another way that you can write it. I'm just going to write out my error object. So if there's an error object passed into here, it will be passed to this named function. So warn is a function or a method inside the console object. So I am passing the error object to that function. So instead of writing out error.message, it'll write out the whole error, but that's okay. We have here the blob. And if I try to console log that, there we go. This is what I got. Blob, it tells me the size, it tells me the type. That's about all that it can tell me. It can't show me the binary data, but it can say, okay, it's a blob object. Now, if I ever wanted to do something with that, like put this in my page, I could do that. It can turn this, which is basically a chunk of memory. So they have now this. Got this chunk of data. In my HTML, I've got right here. Inside of there, I'm going to replace this image with this one that I got back. So to do that, I have to create a URL. Basically, I have to find a way of pointing to that place in memory where this thing is saved. So I will create a URL using that URL object that we talked about before, but it has a method called create object URL. We just have to pass it our blog. Say, here, I've got a bunch of memory. Can you create a URL that points to that spot in memory for me? We will. The source of that equal to this new URL that we just created. There it is. Now this, we'll get a reference to that. Get element by ID, pick. And we will set the source of that equal to this new URL that we just created. There it is. Now this image is a different aspect ratio than the one that we had here. But this is it. We have replaced that original. Here, if I comment this one line out, there's the original image. Run that again. There it is, placed with the one that we fetched from the server. So we went off to pick some photos. Put an image, brought it back. And here, let's change these to match. So we'll say 300 and 200. Now, same aspect ratio. There we go. There's our cute little puppy image. The ones work the same way. So for a font, we're going to get back the reference to the file. It's going to be saved in memory. But then I can write some CSS. I can create a style tag and write some CSS that will point to the create object URL. This URL that we create, I would use that as the value for my source inside of an add font fade style for HTML when that comes back. Instead of using blob, we could do response.text. That's for text files, response.json. We've already talked about that's for JSON files. This one is for text, HTML, and XML files, and CSS, and JavaScript, anything that's text-based. Blob is for images, video, audio, fonts, things like that. All right, so let's switch over to number 5 here. And for number 5, what I have